Our panellists include Kay Rundle, former CEO, Maribyrnong, Geelong, Port Phillip Councils, and former President of LG Pro. Thank you, Kay.
Yay.
Roberto Colanzi, Councillor, Yarra City Council in his first term. Welcome, Roberto, and thanks for coming along. Councillor Angela Altair, long-time councillor and present-day Mayor, Hobsons Bay Council and current board member of the MAV. Thank you, Angela. Judy Maddigan. Judy Maddigan is a former municipal librarian in the city of Footscray. She's a former Essendon councillor. She's a former state member of Parliament, and she was Victoria's first female speaker of the Legislative Assembly. Former councillors, they always come back to the family. Always come back. Councillor Susan Riley is the Deputy Mayor, Melbourne City Council. Susan Riley, thank you for coming along and fitting us into your agenda. John Bennie, who arrived late. Let's not forget John. CEO, City of Greater Dandenong. Former CEO of Manningham and past President of LG Pro, and an all-round good guy. John, thank you for coming along today as well. Former Mayor of Port Phillip, former President of the MAV, author, fashion model, he's an eccentric, and we love him. Dick Ross, over to you to start off with your presentation. Thank you.
But I thought if you could crave my indulgence for a second, I'd just go through a few issues about the separation of powers doctrine and how local government in Victoria offends the separation of powers doctrine because it actually combines powers that are normally separated, and that leads to stress and tension that are unique in governmental offices for councillors. So if we can just go through the next slide, or the next part of the slide. What do I do? So I press this button.
That's it.
Okay, so sorry, this is a bit boring, but I thought, I'm giving you a bit of colour with the movie, you have to endure this. So there's essentially the separation of powers doctrine. It divides the arms of government into four bits that are separated and try and balance each other, but they have different attributes. So if we look at a parliament, and council's a little bit like a parliament, it's short term, people who end up in there are from the laity, they're not experts, and they're obsessed with popularity. They're a large group, and there's a lot of conflict. They yell at each other across this chamber. If we have a look at the next one along, is cabinet. So cabinet is short term, it's a member of the laity, members of the laity, they're not professional experts. They too are obsessed with popularity, but they're a small group, and conflict is kept inside, so there's no public conflict. Public service, it used to be the permanent public service, but it's gone from short term to long term. They're experts, and they've got an ambiguous relationship with popularity. And then finally there's the judiciary, who are permanent employment, they're experts, and they don't give a tinker's cuss about popularity. In fact, they revel in their own popularity. And so, if I can just go through this, if you look at the trends, across the line, employment lengthens. And the more your employment lengthens, the more you have an ability to make an independent decision. And the less stressful is unpopularity. The expertise increases as you go from one end to continuing to another. So that, judges and public servants have much more expertise than elected officials. And then in the other direction is the obsession with popularity. So my thing about the separation of powers is that it gets appropriate people into appropriate places. So where is council in all of this thing? And this is why I say council offends the separation of powers doctrine and why it's got unique stresses. Because council is a bit like Parliament because we're elected and we do policy. policy. It's a bit like cabinet because we're a small group of people, and if there's any open warfare, it's seen as dysfunctional. And we're a bit like a judicial tribunal because we make planning decisions which are judicial. And in judicial decisions, there are winners and losers. And so that's why it's particularly stressful and very different from other forms of governmental organisation, both public service and also elected officials. So I just wanted to put that up there, just to say that when you're conducting meetings, when we're dealing with the decision-making process, Council is in a unique and I would say disadvantageous position because we have people who are skilled in one area, which is to be popular representatives, making expert judicial decisions, and the issue about conflict and suppressing of conflict is somewhere between Cabinet and Parliament, and so it's a bit unresolved and it's a bit hard for councillors to have open warfare and be labelled anything other than dysfunctional, whereas Parliament has open warfare and it's seen as normal. So it's a bit unfair on councils and it's harder accordingly. So that's my input.
Thank you, Dick. That was lovely. Roberto, we'll start at the end and work down. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. It's actually a very difficult question, at least for me, because I'm a first-term councillor and a first-time councillor. So in trying to answer the question, it becomes for whom, or part of the answer starts off for whom, because obviously councillors, council staff and residents are all very much, by default, different stakeholder groups and have different interests and different perspectives and want different outcomes. So the question has to be, for whom are council meetings designed? And part of me trying to find an answer to this question, I found myself sitting very comfortably on the picket fence with all the splinters that entails. There is a self-evident expectation gap with regards to how councillors view meetings, how residents view meetings, and how staff view meetings, and particularly the outcomes. This expectation gap largely arises because every one of those stakeholder groups all think that they've thought out and thought through the issue deciduously. They've got all the evidence, all the logic, all the rationality, they've thought through the pros and cons, and they've come to a final conclusion which will knock out any counter-argument. But once they get into the council meeting, they realise, and particularly for residents who haven't been to a council meeting before or have attended them very infrequently, they realise that it's effectively a sausage factory. And we all know that sausages at the end of the sausage factory and in the supermarkets, are very tasty and blah, blah, blah. But nobody really wants to know what a sausage, what's inside a sausage or how they're in fact made. And my view of all of that is how do you, and again, I haven't really formed a coherent argument or a coherent answer to this question. But this issue of the expectation gap, the issue about the different rationales and different logics that go into it, and how people come out of that process, either satisfied or not satisfied, is one that I think is largely philosophical, but also is the proof in the eating with regards to the sausage on the barbecue. So at that sort of point of mixing up metaphors, I'll hand over.
Thank you, Roberto. We'll be coming back to your barbecue shortly. Angela, over to you.
Thanks, Gavin. I don't know about sausages. I thought I'd just share the experience that I've had chairing the meetings from the last election, which was November. And in a way, what I introduced, and what the council introduced rather, answers the second part of the question, is there a better way? The first thing we did was reconfigured the chamber, because until last November we had our backs to the gallery. that obviously isolated the polity even more. So we reconfigured it so we're in a U-shaped or horseshoe shape, and we're now facing the gallery. So I think they're already, I believe we achieved a better way of communicating and engaging the local residents, the gallery. We also introduced podcasts to our meetings, but one of the first things that we changed on my assuming the mayoralty was the way we used notices of motion. In previous council meetings, when I was a kind of minority, there was a sort of majority clique, if you will. Policies started being developed literally via notices of motion. There was no reports, there was no, orderly build-up to the policy development. It was a very arbitrary thing that was moved at that very stage, the last stage, notice of motion, often without the rest of the council being alerted to that notice of motion being placed on the agenda before we received the papers on the Friday night. We meet on Tuesday nights. And I felt that was a very inefficient way and improper way to run the council. So a particular councillor thought that they could continue this process, and the very first meeting I chaired, that councillor introduced a notice of motion about quite a significant policy change. And I hope I'm not speaking out of turns here, but there was a discussion with the other councillors. We have 4 of the councillors are new, 7-member council, and I discussed with them the inappropriateness of that notice of motion going through that night for the reasons I just gave. There was a collective decision that that particular notice of motion, there was a whole swag of them, would not be seconded. So the motions lapsed. Now the chamber was absolutely full, and the gallery was absolutely aghast and felt that they had been, the mover had been poorly treated. But I can tell you that was the last time that councillor introduced notices of motion that way, because alongside this refusal to accept those notices of motion, I introduced a set of protocols about how the new policy development would be conducted, and it would be a discussion paper that would be listed in the briefing session, and then we could consider it, and then a report would be received from the officers, and we'd proceed that way. I know that sounds long-winded, but in my opinion, that's the kind of reforms that I think makes for a better way. And I just want to throw out to the members of the audience, or the members of the council here, I personally believe Phil Shanahan's challenge that we do away with officers and conduct council meetings solely the councillors themselves, the mayor and councillors, would be a great improvement, I believe, particularly for those councillors who do not attend the briefings beforehand. I think it would be compelling, or compel them to do the reading beforehand, be better informed, and I honestly will go back to my council and see if they will consider it, just as a trial, because I honestly believe that it would be a great improvement, and it will empower us and, as I say, perhaps shift the power back to the elected officials.
Thank you, Angela. Keep us informed as to how you get on with that.
Yeah, I will.
Thank you. Judy Maddigan, former librarian, former councillor, former Member of Parliament, former Speaker of the Legislative Assembly. Is there a better way, Judy, in relation to council meetings?
Thank you. Look, I'm sure there is, and Gavin has told me to try and upset you all as much as I can, so I'm just going to make a few broader comments and then perhaps come on to council meetings at the end. And some of this comes from listening to the discussion today. And firstly, like, democracy is not a cheap form of government. And I think as we take democracy for granted so much in Australia, we forget that if you really want to be a democratic organisation, if you really want to do proper community consultation, it actually is quite a costly process. And I'd be interested at the end to know that when you're designing major projects in your council, how many councils actually do put in the budget a cost for community consultation. Because if you're going to do it really properly, it does take time and it does take money. And so and some of the stuff I'm going to say is stuff that's come to me as a state member of parliament from residents who aren't happy with the way the councils are operating. May I say in saying that there are two people from Moonee Valley Council, my council here, and this does not apply to them because they're excellent council staff and I'm sure they'd never do anything like this. But just briefly then, informing residents of what you're doing after you've made a decision is not consultation. Taking a draft, inviting residents to come in to discuss a project you're undertaking when you've got a draft, listening to their comments, giving them no feedback, and then formally making a decision which exactly what your draft was, which they read about in the local paper, is not community consultation. And their view of you depends pretty much on how you treat them. And I guess that's the same for all of us. It's a truism, isn't it? If you think people are on your side, they normally are. If you think they're against you, they normally are. And a lot of feedback I get from residents has been, you know, the council officer treated me as though I was getting in the way of their work, that they really didn't have time. They didn't have time to talk to me and they didn't have time to discuss things with me. They just wanted me to go away so they could get on with their work. And I think for some of you who are all at higher levels of your council as officers, you probably don't have that experience with residents as much. But I guess in training your staff, what the community expects of them and how to work with them is a really important feature for councils in the future. And councils particularly, councils provide a service which is probably more important to residents than a lot of things that state and federal governments do. Because what you do is immediate, it affects their day-to-day life, and I can assure you for most people, if they can't get a question on a planning issue of something that's going to be built next door to them, that's probably far more important than changes to the Auditor General's Act that's going to go through the state parliament. So they do actually expect quite a different level of service from you than they do from their state and federal members of parliament, and I think it's really important that you realise that and the value that they do put in being able to have full and frank conversations with you. And so I agree with a lot of what Phil said. I think it's really important that councillors are very responsive to the community. And I've just said slightly what I've said. Now, council officers have their role, and that's really important too, and that's to develop policies to work with councillors. But it's the end, councillors have to know what your policies are, or what the policies they've voted for are, and I can assure you it's very irritating, which experience I've had with some councillors, who are quite happy to vote against a policy that they passed just because some residents are upset with them. And I guess the hardest thing for anyone when they first go into politics is to learn to say no or I don't agree with you. But residents actually prefer you to be honest. If you think what they're saying is silly, they'd much prefer you, not to say it's silly, but much prefer you to say, look, we don't agree with you and think it should be done another way. But leave them believing that you agree with them and then find out you don't afterwards. So you've got to be really honest with people, I think. I don't see why at council meetings members of the community who are there can't get up and ask a question without prior notice. I don't think it's appropriate for the response which I often see from council officers. We're working on that, we'll give a report to you in 3 months' time. I don't think that council officers should respond if a member of the community asks a question to a councillor. I think councillors have to be responsive to it. And I think we should keep much better records of how much, when councillors attend meetings. So not only the public meetings, which of course are public, but also private briefings that councillors have, because I think there is a problem with some councillors and they don't get involved with that. And so they're not really in a position in some ways to be able to actually answer realistically questions the community might have with them. So, and in some ways I guess it's taking a step backwards, because it's like the way councillors perhaps used to operate a bit more when they were smaller. And there's nothing more boring than someone saying, when I was a councillor we did it this way. But I think the opportunity for councillors to build a greater respect from their community for them is beneficial to the whole council process and makes councils work a lot better. Just in finishing, next time you go and visit, and I hope you do talk to state and federal members of parliament because they're part of your community as well. Next time you go and talk to them, Ask them how much time they spend on dealing with people complaining about councils or not getting a satisfactory response from council, and I think you might be a bit surprised at the response. So there you are with all those terrible criticisms. I'll now leave you.
Thank you, Judy. Kay Rundle, is there a better way?
Well, that's certainly an interesting one to follow. I was probably most taken a bit what Angela said with Phil's suggestion that there not be any officers at a council meeting, because that's what happens in Parliament. And when you think about it, and I hear my friends and family talking about, Minister Garrett, he should have known, about, that horrible thing with the electricity, and people actually shoot it home to the person, to the politician. They never talk about, because I know, as a public servant, what goes on behind it, who actually runs the program, but we actually hold state and federal members personally responsible, but it doesn't happen so much in council. I think it is a little bit because, people do expect that council officers, and like when I was at Geelong, the Geelong editor said, we want to talk to the officers because we know that that's where the real decisions happen. And that's not a good perception, and it's not a good reality. So one of the things that I certainly did with a lot of the councils I worked with is sometimes when I went there, when you had a council meeting, officers would sometimes present for up to 20 minutes on an issue, and then councillors might move and second it and vote on it. And so therefore the perception and the reality became that the officers were running it and the councillors were rubber stamping it. And so, like Angela was talking about, we made changes to ensure that the councillors were briefed enough so they spoke to it, and I think the debate should happen there. So that sort of sense of having a briefing where councillors debate, come to an agreed, and then when they go out in public, they don't have the debate, because then people, as I think Dick or Gavin was talking about, see them as dysfunctional. I think it's a real challenge with that. And so to go with having no officers, I think that'll be a really good experiment. And as Gavin said, let us know how you go. But you can certainly run it in a way that's much more respectful, that it actually is the council meeting and the officers are the servants of the council. And many, many officers do struggle with that because they are maybe not being as good as they should be to the public, but often they're being abused by the same people that they should be being responsive to, because particularly poor old planners, they just get abused every single day of their career. So that whole sort of balance between the fact that officers need to present and do a lot of the work and do good consultation. I agree with Judy there. But at the end of the day, at council meetings, they should be seen very, very much as the councillors and the meeting. Councillors can't be expected to know everything. They are huge councils. City of Greater Geelong, 230, whatever it is now, 1,000 people, over 2,000 staff. There's no way those 12 councils can know, 13 now, or 13 Jan, 12 at the moment, can know everything that's going on. But I think it needs to be just done in a way that perception and reality become the same, because as you know, perception does become reality, that the councillors really are seen, and they do have debates. There's nothing better than people having a debate and disagreeing with each other. And what Judy says is right. I remember one time at one council when we came out in the paper and said, guess what, we stuffed up, we made a mistake and we're going to fix it up. And the other thing that I'm passionate about, and I know everyone doesn't agree with this, I don't think officers should ever be quoted in the public. When do you see this head of, sometimes you do actually, recently in the federal election with the Treasury coming out and saying they didn't cost anything, but most of the time it's actually the politicians who are quoted and who stand up. And some councils do prefer that the bad news is the CEO and the good news is the mayor. That's okay. But I think it all should be, the quotes should always be from the council. So that's just my new rule. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. John Bennie, CEO of Dandenong. Dandenong was very progressive some years ago in webcasting, being one of the first councils to webcast their council meetings. John, over to you. Is there a better way?
Thanks, Gavin. Look, at the beginning of the stage, I guess I could say ditto to all of the previous speakers. I certainly agree with what Kay said and all of the other speakers, although I would add a word of caution about what Angela said about the rate at which you might move in the direction of implementing change, and I'll say a bit more about that. I mean, this session to me is all about the quality of decision making. And if the question is asked, is there a better way in terms of developing quality decisions, I guess the answer always has to be yes. We always need to be pursuing better decision-making processes. Quality decisions, in my view, are informed decisions that deliver ultimate benefit or optimal benefit to the community and the council. And I don't think we ever take decisions that necessarily achieve those ideals or those particular outcomes. I think we've probably all now seen Phil's broadcast. I watched it on YouTube in the office late yesterday afternoon, and whilst I found it very thought-provoking, I thought Phil was probably in many respects defining the show of utopia, only in that that's where we all might wish to be. But again, I make the point that I think we ought to be cautious about the rate at which we move in that direction. Our sector as a whole, and my council in particular, are absolutely committed to continuous improvement, and certainly being open-minded about the way that we do things, not being fixated on the way that we've always done things in the past. But if you are committed to continuous improvement, I think you couldn't help but respond to the question, is there a better way, and say, yes, there must be. But the issue, as I've said, is more about then the rate of change. At what rate are we prepared to move in the direction of implementing change rather than necessarily the extent of change. I don't, as I said, labour on the past, but I think the systems we've had have served us very well for many, many years. I think invariably the local government sector has delivered some very good decisions in specific municipalities. So, but notwithstanding, there is a move for change. We're seeing it in our particular council, whether it be younger generations, whether it be new entrants to our municipality, and we have many of those from many overseas countries. They're looking for things to be dealt with and addressed in another way. So we'd be foolish not to take heed of that move for change. But again, I come and I repeat the point about as we intend to move towards change, we need to phase that in progressively. We need to protect the reliability and continuity of sound decision making that invariably exists in our models at the moment. And that's the only point I make, Andrew, about we can trial new things, but if we trial new things and we potentially jeopardise the soundness or reliability of decision making, well, then we've potentially made a mistake. So if we can protect the soundness of what we've got, but then move it in the direction of what our communities are looking for, I think we will have at least moved in a forward direction.
Great, thank you, John. Councillor Susan Riley, Deputy Mayor of Melbourne.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to be different because I think council meetings don't need to be reinvented. They are a forum for formal decisions. However, at the City of Melbourne, we are refining our meetings rather than reinventing. And for example, we've introduced public question time at the beginning and the end of our future Melbourne committee meetings, which we didn't have before, and that is twice a month. The public are welcome, and we allocate a 15-minute time slot for anyone to ask a question on any topic relating to council. We don't require any prior notice, so people can just come on in and ask. And isn't that what local government's about? So it is just another way of getting public participation in an open forum. They've also introduced audio of the committee meetings on the web, which is also a first for us, and we allow public oral submissions on all items of our future Melbourne committee meetings. So there's plenty of opportunity there for people to come on in and have a say. But I also want to be really clear, there's no blurring of accountability at the City of Melbourne. Councillors are elected to make decisions, and that is what we do. We have a strong submission culture because we want to make informed decisions based on the latest facts and figures. Now, to do otherwise would, in my opinion, and the City of Melbourne's, would be irresponsible. And that's why we listen to the views of the stakeholders, but we couldn't do that, or we just couldn't, without the officers. We need the officers. We need them to write reports because we really do believe in their professional judgment. And if we didn't do that, what would the council be like? They're there to help, and we are there to implement the decisions. So, satisfaction is number one with councillors. We want to give the right thing to our stakeholders, and we do feel that if we have good information, we can work on it. If we have information we're not happy with, we have a procedure, defer, and then go away and get it right. From our perspective, the City of Melbourne does believe that the information is the most crucial thing from our officers and CEO to make the right decisions, and we wouldn't like to see that go away. Our officers are there to assist, but they are not there to participate on the debate. The council officers can sometimes present their reports, but only if a councillor asks them to speak or clarify. And I think that's also very important in the debating. In short, they are there to present and answer questions, not to enter into the debate. I think the other thing that we're seeing a lot of now is in community engagement. Everybody wants to be consulted, and it's still an area that needs a little bit more work done on, in my opinion. The community engagement programs is something that the city is always trying to achieve to the best of its ability. But no matter what the topic is, there's always somebody who comes along and says, I didn't know. And so to the best of our ability is probably the question there. So we do encourage this, and we allow presentations on agenda items to be up to 3 minutes long, so anyone that is presenting to council has the opportunity to get their point of view across very quickly. And so it is very important to get the outcomes that are positive, and that can only be a good thing. The only other thing I wanted to touch on is the notice of motions. I think they do serve a purpose, and it is something, and many times with the council, it is an officer report that can be presented back to the committee. A councillor can call that in so that we're maybe not quite happy or don't have enough information. It does give the council an opportunity to consider it further on merits, and I don't think it is something that the councillors should overdo. Though we're having a bit of a run at the moment, aren't we, Stephen May? Councillor Stephen May, we are having a bit of a run on that. But that is also really good because it is a new council, and we do have 5 new councillors, and if they want to get their points of view across, a notice of motion sometimes does give them the opportunity to get the information they need to make the right decision. So there is a role for notice of motions, and we look forward to a great future for the City of Melbourne.
Fantastic. Thank you, Councillor Riley. That's good. Now, your question time, can I just ask you there, you have a section there where people can come in and verbally ask questions. Is that at your council meeting, or is it at one of your committee meetings?
So we're talking
Yes.
Sorry,
the question time. The question time, yeah. People can come in and ask questions.
Yes.
That's at the council meeting, or is it at one of the committee meetings?
It's at the committee meetings.
Committee meetings, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And the questions at question time in the formal council meeting?
No.
No. Okay, yep, no worries. Thank you. Over the crowd, just remember, Philip Shanahan is not a lunatic. He's one of the most respected people in local government, consults to 44 councils. He says, give it a thought to consider having no officers in council meetings. We've also got Councillor Altair, who's going to go back and give it a crack with her fellow councillors. Is there anyone else in this room? I look at the elected representatives, I think, would you entertain the idea of going back and giving it a crack with your fellow councillors to see whether or not a council meeting will be able to operate without any officers there? Can we have a show of hands? Ooh, it doesn't look good. It doesn't look good. Yes, we've got yes. And the council? Only if it was your court. Yes, that's right. And no one here?
Yeah, we'll give it a try.
What council, sir? Alpine Shire.
Good on you.
Alpine. Is that Albert? No. That's a shake of the head. No, that's okay. That's a definite shake of the head. Fantastic.
That's not a good idea. It's not a good idea. Why would you do it? I mean, when you look at the way, sorry to go back to my analysis of the Westminster system, but like officers and councillors have 2 distinct roles, and you need both roles represented in the room when the decision's made. You do need the elected members of the laity to represent the community and try and make as an informed choice as possible, but you also need the full-time experts to inform the decision, so it's not just plucking a straw out of the wind. I mean, I think that I see no upside to Phil's suggestion at all, and it is actually transparent. So when you get a highly technical report of 30 pages to do with, or 130 pages, and it's a $60 million decision, and the poor old councillors are a bit confused, so first, moved, seconded, carried, no discussion. Well, that's actually a true reflection of how some of those decisions are going to be made. You've got these full-time experts who spend 6 weeks writing a report. Of course it's going to be, it's going to probably speak for itself, and why should?
Can I add, at the City level we have 1-page reports?
Yeah.
Not 6 pages.
But isn't part of it also... Sorry, isn't part...
Before we do Roberto, can we go to Angela and then Roberto?
Obviously, I was being deliberately provocative. In fact, under our current system, the officers don't say very much at all and are there to simply answer questions. But I'm going to, obviously, we need buy-in as well. I mean, I'm not just some sort of autocrat, but what I was going to say was, one of the things that the officers do, which I continue to be uncomfortable about, is we too have a public question time. It comes at the end of the meeting, and the questions must be submitted in writing on the spot. So we invite them to complete a form during the meeting. And there's all sorts of constraints. The chair can decide whether the question is relevant and, or it's confidential information that we can't give out that night. And the questioner must be present when the question is read out. But this is the problem. The officers write the response, and then the chair, myself, reads out the answer. So if the council meeting was conducted entirely and solely by the council, the elected officials, with the obviously, the officers being present, it would compel us to give those answers, and I think would demonstrate how much we're across the various issues. And so maybe as a soft introduction to this, radical shift, we could start there.
Thank you, Angela. Sir.
Matthew Gordon from Altair, which is an e-democracy organisation. I'd like to put a question to all panellists. If you were a citizen, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not at all and 10 being with gusto, how likely would you attend one of your own council meetings, and why?
Sorry, what was the question? What was the final bit of your sentence?
How often?
How likely would you attend one of your own council meetings on a scale of 1 to 10? 1 being not at all, 10 being with gusto, and then why?
If you were to council.
Yes. Well, you'd have to be a masochist, I would have thought. Well, the issue becomes one for residents, is they only engage with council once a year when they get their rate notice, and then therefore complain about the obvious increase. But then when they have an issue, and once they've gone through all the mechanics and the architecture of dealing with the bureaucracy, and then if and when the issue comes before council, that is when, at that point, they enter into the sausage factory of dealing with council. So again, it's this expectation gap problem. So it's hard to tell within the city of Yarra, because we have a highly sophisticated residents, a series of residents who are either in terms of their academic background, but also they're politically engaged. And so it's a question of, do they interact formally or do they interact informally? And then again, it's my point about who are they interacting with. If they're interacting with councillors, they get a different result. If they're interacting with staff, they're getting a different result. If they're interacting with each other through formal or informal community groups, and then how does that work into the system? So it's hard to say, and to put it on a Leichhardt scale like that would be very difficult across the board. On a particular issue, if it's planning, you'd say probably 8 or 9 out of 10. If it's something more mundane, probably, I think across the board within Yarra, and I'm speaking as a resident first and foremost, which is my most longer term experience of Yarra, we do things operationally very, very well. So the question would be, why would you need to go to council for the mundane stuff? Because things just get fixed. So that would be my response.
Angela?
Years ago, the gallery was always packed. Local residents rather come to the council meeting than watch West Wing because it was highly entertaining. we were a highly dysfunctional council, and
just opinionated.
we had calls of the council, there was walkouts, the press loved us. In the last few years, the press complained that nothing much happens and it's all quite quiet. There's a few, 3 or 4 elderly chaps who come every night, but I'm sure every council has that. And finally, I guess it depends whether you live in Williamstown or Laverton. If you live in Laverton, not at all. You probably don't even know you have a council. In Williamstown, particularly if it's a planning matter, you'd be turning up every week. It seems to me that it's very subjective and depends. But can I just say, one of the commitments I made when I was elected mayor was to, have greater engagement with the community, and we fiddled around with the format of the meetings, as I explained, but also we have them off-site, where we're trying very hard to engage the community more greatly. I must say that the only time I really fill the gallery, apart from when there's, a hot issue, is when I present a certificate of appreciation to some, local worthy. And then, of course, the gallery is absolutely packed. But after that presentation is made, it's very, very demoralising because, as you probably have all experienced, you see a mass walk out, and then you usually have to, wait until people have disappeared, and then it's back down to the 3 old men.
I wonder if every council has those 3 old men, the same old 3 that just keep going around every council meeting, staying home Monday night watching Four Corners. That's the question. Now, Councillor Riley, if you weren't a councillor, would you attend a council meeting, by golly?
Possibly no. I would only do it on an issue based if there was something that was affecting my life, whether it be planning or community. I do live in the city, but I also have a home in Upper Flintry Gully, and I've never been to the Knox Council.
You'd be very welcome.
Yes, our friend from Knox. Now, former councillor Dick Ross, since you're no longer a council, first question is, have you been back to the council?
In the gallery? Only in the lead up to the last unsuccessful election. So no, I'm not a permanent habitué of the local council. So, is council a spectator sport? No. But I have to tell you that when things were firing at Port Phillip, the gallery was chock-a-block for a lot of the time, and had far more there than State Parliament. So State Parliament's empty too. So, you have to ask yourself about what, as a criterion, what is a full gallery indicative of? And it might not be, indicative of anything. And, the federal gallery is generally pretty full. You can understand why, but people go there, sit for 5 minutes and then move on, because unless it's question time, it's like stabbing your temples with knitting needles. And, but can I just take an excursus?
Yes.
Judy Maddigan was incredibly mean about local government. We're going to let her get away with it. I'm not.
Yes. All right.
I'm not.
No, that's good. Well, just hold it right there, because we've got some other people here from the audience who may let her get away with it. Sharon Ellis over here from Whitehorse. John's coming.
He's moving slowly.
I agree with Angela. We've got our 3 people that regularly sit out, but when we've got a contentious planning issue, we usually have up to 100 people there, and then they will all leave. And we've actually considered the possibility that we might change our agenda around every month and trick them. So planning is later in the agenda, and that way they'll have to secure our wonderful municipal health plan and our budget and all the other items that they should be listening to. And we reserve the planning issue to the end of the meeting, but we won't tell them in advance. How's that sound?
Sinister.
You always lock the doors when
Thank
they're
you.
out.
I'll take that as a comment. We have a question over here. I think yes, the lady over here.
Question here.
Hannah, yep. And then John, can you give it to Councillor Lowe?
Hi, I'm Pam Clark from Councillor Pam Clark from Horsham Royal City. Just discussing, this is my third term, but I had a 4-year break in the last term. But just talking to different councillors about how they run meetings. The thing that doesn't impress me is the fact that every council runs them differently. So when you talk about, is there a better way? I think in reality, each one of us need to go back and say, are we doing it the right way? There's councils here that have no debate in a council meeting unless there's a dissenter. There's councils here that have way bigger than Horsham, have one meeting a month for 1 hour. That's not democracy. One meeting, an hour, to rubber stamp decisions already made behind closed doors. To me, that's not democracy. So I think we all need to go back and say, how can we do it better? But I don't think anyone here can make decisions for each individual council because we're all doing it so differently. And I think that's the big issue for me.
Yep. Thank you, Pam. Just in relation to that, is there anyone here from any council that has any unscripted question times?
Yes, City of Melbourne.
Yes, in their council meetings?
Yeah.
Right, so from the public gallery, they don't have to fill in forms, they get up and ask questions.
City,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Next question, Councillor Lowe.
Thanks, Gavin. Just a question to Judy. Unlike Dick, I'm not going to let Judy get away with some of the comments and views on local government. Just wanted to get your opinion on this. You talked about the sort of the type of consultations we, as a sector, currently do with our community. But I have to say that given that local government is the only level of government that actually brings out a draft budget, unlike state and federal governments, what other ways are there for us to improve our consultation processes? Are there something we can learn from state government? Just want to get
Look, I guess it's the way of doing your consultations, which are the things that people have complained to me about. And that is just not feedback to people. Look, I think some of the public meetings and stuff council organises are terrific, but you've got to have that feedback to the residents. And you've got to be honest with them, I think. So if you're having a meeting about something you want to do in the future, and you invite residents to come to put perhaps your draft budget or your draft plan for them, I think you really, and it's probably because the council officers who have to do it to a certain extent because they've done all the work with it. I think you've got to say to those people while we're there, look, thanks for your idea, that won't work because of such and such and such. So that you're actually quite honest with the people. And I know there's a tendency for council officers, and I'm not blaming them for this, as I was saying before, for anyone, it's really hard to say, I don't agree with what you've said, but if you can explain to them why, and what the practicalities, at least that person feels that their views have been listened to, rather than just taking their views and saying, we'll tell you in 3 months' time what we're doing. Look, and consultation is difficult, and I know all of you will sometimes think, oh my God, if I have that resident ring me up again about another thing, I'll absolutely scream. So in some cases, residents do put off councillors from reacting with them because you do, get people who really are quite uninformed and want to have a view on anything. But I guess part of that, if you get the confidence of the community, they're much more likely to come and raise things with you and actually ask, can you have a meeting and come and explain to us? So it's just trying to keep those channels of communication open, I think. And as I was saying, that's costly. You've got to put that into your budgets, that it's not cheap to do that, and you really have to ensure that you can do that. And you have to explain to the community, who probably say we often want to pay less rates, explain, look, we're going to do this, but there is a cost involved, so at least you're being honest with them about what you're doing all the time. And some councils do that very well. Some councils need a bit of work on it.
Could I just say?
Yes,
I'm going anyway. Look, the difficulty with consultations is actually quite difficult to understand what consultation is. Consultation is not abdication. What I mean by that is if you speak to people in a consultation, you just don't have to roll over and let them and have your tummy tickled. You have to listen and take things into account. That's consultation, it's not abdication. So I've been in situations where people wanted a refusal, but instead of a refusal they got a whole swag of onerous conditions which changed the ultimate decision in a dramatic way, but they left the building unhappy because they thought that, first of all, consultation meant that in a judicial situation, a number of arms in the air from the gallery was relevant, whereas actually it's not that relevant. It's a judicial decision, reviewable in a judicial tribunal. And secondly, sometimes they aren't recognised, that people don't recognise when you've actually listened and made a significant alteration to your decision. And then they go off whinging and diddle-gobbing to the receptive ears of state parliamentary representatives who are love saying, oh, those councillors, they're bloody hopeless. And, you know, we have to be quite scholarly and academic about this, and it's very difficult to do. Just as democracy is expensive, a review and inquiry into how effective democracy is has to be quite objective, scholarly and expensive to undertake. And anecdotal evidence by aggrieved members of the community in state government offices may or may not be completely and utterly misleading.
Thank you, Dick. Now, Councillor Jennifer Yang from Manningham, did you have a question? No? Sorry, that's okay. Can we go over here, just behind you, Stephen, is our Administrator, Joanne Anderson from Brimbank. Fantastic you could join us today. Joanne.
That's the wrong name, Gavin.
Sorry, yes, that's right. Yes. Stephen, go. Okay, we'll have Stephen.
Good public company boards will have an independent directors only meeting at the start of the board meeting before management come in, and they'll also have one at the end. It seems to me the question is not having council meetings without officers. The biggest question for councillors is, do we have organised councillor-only meetings? At Manningham, the officers will start panicking if you call it councillor-only, what's going on,
Yes.
At Melbourne, we have one every week, 90 minutes at lunch every Tuesday. No officer conspiracy theories because it's always on. So the big question is, are councillors organising scheduled regular councillor-onlys? That's the best way to separate out the officer versus council question, not kicking them out of the council meetings in Parliament.
Thank you, Stephen. That's a comment. I wonder if any of our panellists would like to comment on that.
Well,
Jane, Nathan, apologies for that.
We certainly do that at Yarra. We meet for half an hour. We meet on a fortnightly basis, and we meet for half an hour before each of those meetings, which is a useful process to tease out particular issues and live issues. But again, it goes back to the fundamental issues about councillors, because we're fundamentally part-time. And for the most part, so we're juggling life and work. And the other issue, of course, is with councillors, which we all know, is that with state parliamentarians and certainly federal parliamentarians, they have electorate officers, they have advisors, they have an office infrastructure to help them, protect them, etc., etc. And there's a natural barrier, if you like, between them and the residents or the citizens. With councillors, it's live every minute of the day. There's no buffer between me and a resident. They all have, they can all call me, etc., etc. But again, I can't delegate an issue to my electorate officer to sort out an issue. I have to manage the process all the way through. And again, I have to be, like we all are, fundamentally experts and non-experts at the same time on a whole range of very complex issues, from economics, legal, planning matters, transport management, public health, community health, library services, a whole range of things. And that complexity can be really tough. And it gets back to the issue about how do you manage a meeting, a council meeting, how do you make that work that satisfies all of those things? And whether having officers there or not is all important to have. But there isn't one, as another councillor said earlier, there isn't one solution and one fix. And simply because of the complexity of it, and councillors trying to do probably too many things and too much, and over-deliver in a sense, which is not meant to be a criticism, but is a statement of fact.
Thanks, Roberto. Councillor Riley, then a comment from perhaps John Bennie, and then a question from Bob Lenny from Wellington.
I was just going to add to what Councillor Main said. Every Monday, late Monday afternoon, I ring 10 councillors, including the Lord Mayor, and ask them what he wants on the agenda for councillor only. And every councillor has the right to put anything they like on that agenda. And as Councillor Main said, it is the most informative time of the whole week where we get together and we just talk about all portfolios and anything that might have happened. I think it is one of the most important meetings of the council.
Thank you, Councillor Riley. John?
Look, I think Stephen's idea is an entirely sensible proposition. I guess that comes back as previous sessions were talking about. It comes down to the culture of the council that exists. I guess if there's a culture of distrust between the executive and council, that's why officers are going to get a bit nervous about councillors having councillors only type sessions. And not every council has councillors who hold portfolios. So I guess the agenda that the councillors only session might deal with could be different in many other councils. But I think if we can ever get to a situation in the sector where we have well-developed and entrenched trust and respect between the executive arm of council and the elected arm, then I think the models that have been suggested are entirely satisfactory. I did want to make a comment on a point that was made earlier too.
Yes, go ahead.
Because it was made in the context of if there is no debate on an item in a council meeting, well, that it seemed to follow that meant that the decision had been made before the meeting, or there was a lack of democracy. I don't think that necessarily follows. I'm the first to say that some of the decision-making processes can be improved. I've experienced generally two forms of decision-making. An item is moved, seconded, the speaker, the mover speaks, the seconder speaks, and then it still may not be opposed. In my own council at the moment, we've had it for a long while, and again there are some improvements on this. It's moved, seconded. If there is no opposition, the item passes. And many in the gallery would say, well, so where's the debate? The reality was, as Stephen Dickett said, there is no need for debate because there was no opposition on the matter. So some are left asking the question, well, how did you come to that decision and did you make it prior to the council meeting? Well, I guess when the agendas in our case are sent out a full week and a half before a council meeting, and we have two council meetings a month, and councillors have a week and a half effectively to interact with the planning directors. It might be in a planning situation and explore and develop and inform themselves about taking a decision. And I can say categorically that I don't see any evidence in my council of decisions being made by groups of councillors, by a majority of councillors before a meeting. Then I would fully expect that they are making a decision on the floor of the chamber based on the evidence that they've got before them. Those same reports are in the public domain. Anyone who wants to read them can come to their own conclusions about how the decisions are made. So that's not saying that we can't perhaps be a bit more explanatory about things, and I know that some of our councillors are now seeking to take a meeting procedure local law opportunity when an item is not opposed to actually get up, having moved the item, and give a brief explanation of what the decision has been and why the mover sought to do that. So that's a minor improvement, but it's, I just didn't want to go unchecked, I guess, a view that certainly prevails in our community or in the minds of some in our galleries, that some of those practices translate through to democracy.
Thank you, John. And hang on, Dick, we'll just go Kane.
So just to add to that, I actually really agree with councillor only time. I know what John's saying. If there's lack of trust, then officers can get very nervous. But if there's lack of trust, councillors are having their own time on Sunday afternoon at each other's places. I worked at a council when I was in the COC. I was absolutely paranoid about councillors ever having any conversation about them. He would stay and outlast any council 3 or 4 in the morning having a drink. And he actually, the instruction to us at second level was never allow councillors to have a discussion by themselves. And he actually genuinely meant it, and it doesn't work. It's just rubbish. Whereas you actually have that scheduled time, so it's not like a secret meeting that we've called it. Audit committees sometimes do it too. It's really terrific if the audit committee meets for 15 minutes before anyone joins them. If there is an issue, they'll talk about it. Most of the time there isn't, but it actually gives people a sense that there is a space and a time and it's permission to do it. And if there are issues that come out, then they can be addressed. So in the councils where I've actually been CEO, we've always had that, and I've always found it work really well.
Thank you, Kate. Dick Ross.
Well, can I just say, I've been aware of councils where it was difficult to get the sufficient calibre to discuss some technical issues. Often I kept my mouth shut and didn't debate, not through any lack of transparency.
I find that hard to believe.
I'm going to go home and cry now. It is true. I am a bit of a big mouth. I apologise. Anyway, look, you know, there were times when I was just terrified to open my mouth because there was a large gallery. There was an expectation that we were all going to say something wise. I had nothing to say that was wise. I sort of really wasn't across the paper. I would ask something about the punctuation on page 47, and then I would vote. So, you know, it comes down to, I keep on harping on this, about the separation of powers doctrine in Westminster and what each part of the governance model has to offer to the situation. So, in deeply technical issues, you know, 9 councillors out of 10 are going to find it very difficult to make a very informed contribution. And in some communities, it might be 10 out of 10. And you know, I don't have to name those communities. So maybe it looks like a terrible lack of transparency, but maybe we've got to start to be honest about the technical difficulties, the value add, the true value add that councillors bring to a meeting, and the true value add that officers, technical experts bring to a meeting. And that's hard to say because there is high expectations that democracy will throw up people who are immediately capable of informed, vigorous and wise leadership, and it's sort of not true. Well, we don't dare mention it.
No, all right. Thank you, Dick. We'll come to Albert. I've just got one. Bob Wenger, Councillor of Wellington Shire. Wellington was one of 4 councils to the webcast. Bob, how did you find it?
I thought the first track of the webcast was no.
How many hits do you get?
And we got one which was we're a third largest Shire, and it is a remote in way for people to come down to the White Country and everybody can get there. But the reason one question I do want to ask is we're talking about the live webcast. We do actually have a question and answer time on our webcast, and I'm just wanting you to do the same. People can actually type in and put their questions through, and the questions are answered at the session.
That's right. So it's an email the questions and then they get answered through the council.
Yeah, they do give answers on that sort of all live on the web. We're just wondering whether the Dan on does the same.
You got a hashtag for Twitter as well?
John,
no, we don't. We webcast our council meetings, not as long as Wellington has, but I think that's an initiative I'm sure some of my councillors would be happy to hear. So,
how many hits do you get?
On the webcast?
Yeah.
Well, we've got 11 councillors times their family members. I think it's probably about 100 a meeting or something along those lines.
Well, that's surprisingly high. That's good.
That's great. Okay, further questions? We've probably got time for one more. Yes, Albert, sorry. Albert.
Thank you, Gavin. Thank you for the opportunity for the panel this afternoon. I thoroughly enjoyed it. But I think the problem lies here for the public that perceive that sort of understand. From my experience is that every second Wednesday of the month we do our ordinary meeting, and every last Wednesday of the month we receive briefing session papers. Now the briefing session papers are discussed, and the following fortnight is the ordinary meeting. And when we are briefed, we generally more or less know exactly where that item is going to go. So when it's presented in the ordinary meeting, you've generally got a consensus as to how we're going to vote. And of course discussion does take place and motions are moved and amendments are made to the item, and I strongly recommend that the officers and directors are there to only clarify any points of that item. The question is now is that to be really transparent to our community, I see it that we probably shouldn't really be briefed the briefing should be actually the ordinary meeting, because I don't want to use this word rehearsed, but what we were briefed is presented again at the ordinary meeting. I just want the panel's view on that, because I think at certain points, at certain items of the agenda, it's, again I don't want to use it, but it's repetitive. So what's your view, panel?
So in effect what you're saying is that the briefing sessions can detract from the theatre of the open council meeting, where there's a bit more robust discussion, or to search out the answers. So it's somewhat sanitised down, and you go in there, and the community sitting in the gallery saying, well, you know, who's really in control here? The officers, because there's no real, you know, digging or, you know, from the council laws to...
I'm not saying all of it there, but at times, as you said, some of the items could be sanitised, and the robust discussion has probably taken place in the briefing session.
Okay, so, councillors on the panel, is there, are we lacking the theatre, if you like, of the decision-making processes around the council table? Angela?
Thanks for that. That's a really good question, because I grapple continuously with the fact that the best stuff, the most robust discussion takes place, of course, at the briefings. And so by the time, as you say, the matter comes to the ordinary council meeting, the actual formal council meeting, we've had that debate, and particularly if there's broad consensus about an important matter, it just goes through. In fact, I often have to prompt the mover and seconder to speak at some length to it, because, you know, if it's a $1 million contract, say, or, you know, and perhaps people are feeling tired, that I don't believe there's an adequate time or discussion has been given to that topic. I should also add, though, that the council has a weekly advertorial, so we announce all the decisions that were made the night before. I also do a podcast after each meeting, so where people can, you know, where I do summarise some of the big decisions that were made. I guess it's all about trying to communicate with people, but it's still talking at them at this stage.
John Bennie. Yeah, look, I'm just a humble officer, but I'd like to express a view. I mean, a council is not theatre. It should never be a theatre in my view. It's a forum for council decision making. Councillors have significant responsibilities in taking sound and informed decisions about matters that they should have been comprehensively briefed on and or reported on in the lead up to that. I think anyone who comes to a council meeting looking for a bit of theatre is there for the wrong reason, and they should not be entertained. It even goes back, I think, to the issue of, manufacturing debate or argument, if that's what the gallery wants to hear. If an item is not opposed, then why manufacture, I guess, an opposition just so that the gallery can actually see a bit of entertainment? Again, I go back to my experience. The lively debates that might occur in a briefing session are all about matters that aren't on the council agenda. They might be the early emergence of a domestic animal strategy, where councillors quite rightly are expressing views and officers are expressing their professional opinions around the development of the strategy. Now, ultimately, when that finds its way to a council meeting to be signed off, yeah, perhaps all of that debate has occurred. But, you know, we have another number of other consultation processes that would go along in parallel with that, where the domestic animal lobby might be involved in all of that and can be involved and engaged and understand what's being said.
Thank you. I'll come to Councillor Riley. Dick, then Judy, and then Councillor Riley.
Oh, I just wanted to be the anti-Julian Assange person in the room and say that Ange made the point that, you know, and John sort of corroborated that some of the best conversation is in the behind closed doors meetings, and that's because candour blossoms when you don't have the theatre of the meeting. So you have candour, you have the honest question, dear officer, or Mr. or Madam CEO, I sort of don't understand this, could you say it all again? You wouldn't dream of saying something as honest in a public meeting, whereas candour blossoms behind closed doors, and then you get kicked in their head for wanting to have confidential briefings when they're the most meaningful conversations that you might have about difficult technical subjects.
Thank you. Judy?
Just a couple of things, just in relation to what you said, John. I think if all councillors agree on a decision, it doesn't mean that they all came to that decision for the same reason. And I think the community is interested to know why councillors came to that decision. So I think there's a reasonable cause for councillors to say why they voted for something, because they probably often come from totally different directions. In relation to Dick's comments, it's interesting, isn't it? I think if the officers are briefing councillors and councillors have specific questions they want answered, aren't they the same questions that probably the community want answered as well? So perhaps we could do it a different way. Perhaps when councillors have briefing, if there's a question that's really important to the councillors, perhaps when the council papers come out on the website and when they're released, those questions should be answered. This topic has raised some issues easily answered, because I'm pretty sure that the questions that councillors are asking are the same questions that the community want answers to as well. That's what I was going to say.
Good idea. Thank you. Councillor Riley?
Look, in the past council, not in this one, but in the past councillors have been very entertaining, and you usually find out in the council meeting or you look up at the gallery, the media is in attendance.
You reached into my soul.
They are politicians, aren't they?
There you go. Councillor Jackie Frestaki has a question.
Jackie Frestaki, Yarra. I'm rather intrigued by the suggestion that just because something has been discussed at briefing, that might stifle debate in council. I don't know about others, but I need to read things and have things discussed 3 or 4 times before I'm across them. Because and if you discuss it at briefing, you often find that there's many more issues. The second time you read it might be a month later, but at least you know a bit about the background. And in response to Judy's point about the questions asked that the community might well ask, which are asked at briefing, well, it is anticipated, I think it tends to happen here, that those issues are incorporated into an officer report, and then there is that opportunity for residents to see it that way, or other members of the community to see it that way. And of course, the response, the way the officers address that issue might be one that the councillors disagree with. But apart from the speaking to and against a motion, certainly at City Yarra, I find even if the matter has been at a briefing a month earlier, usually it's about a month earlier, it might be 2 weeks earlier, there's a lot of time at council where councillors ask the officer or the director or the CEO questions about the matter that's being debated. Well, it's not debated at that stage, but to clarify a lot of things, and there'll be questions asked by members of the public, which might take quite some time. So by the time you get to move and second it, there's been a lot of the issues discussed through questions from both councillors and members of the audience. So you can then, and in some instances, people don't speak very, very briefly in favour of the motion because it's sort of developed a consensus by that stage that you've refined the motion and added amendments, and there's been a whole lot of changes made, and then it can sail through. So, I mean, that does happen on key matters in democracy in action, taking on board suggestions from a whole range of people. And that's distinguished, of course, from the much more perfunctory ones that can go through because it's just a report that might be a financial report you read, you discussed before, or it might be some assemblies of councils to know. So I'd be interested in the comments on that direction. Sort of question time by community and councillors, which are part of the assessment and information gathering process.
Councillor Altair.
You're quite right, Jackie. And as I said, for me, it's the eternal kind of struggle between, being transparent and at the same time, having some sort of time limits. But it occurs to me that those questions that are raised at the briefing are incorporated in some way in the agenda through the various sections. There's various categories sections of the report that are that would answer those questions that were raised, or indeed the report itself would be revised in some way. But can I just jump in one more way that I believe we can improve meetings and we can better engage the community and inform them, and that is the language of those reports. I think that the management speak is very hard for people to understand, and maybe one of the reforms that we can all introduce is look at the language, that make it plainer and perhaps clearer, and maybe take a leaf from that British Council who introduced, the plain language policy some years ago, and I think they actually decided to fine the officers if they didn't, I think they had Don Watson's book next to them, the death sentence to...
Angela, you would need to ask if it's more than one page.
Oh, well, that's right. I must have a look at your reports.
Councillor Riley, did you wish to... No, okay. Look, I'm conscious of the time. Maybe we'll have one more question and chat down the end here. Yes, John, we know the time. The chap down the end here behind Helen from Brimbank, would you like to pose the final question for today's session? So we've got a, excuse me, Hannah, we've got to have a microphone here. Poor chap down the end.
Oh, younger council.
Thank you. Councillor Oliver from the City of Darwin. I'm interested to know, do you think that it would be good if there was more of a culture of councillors from one municipality going to, going to meetings of other councils? Because listening to the discussion here today, I've been thinking, okay, well we've got we've got public question time, but we don't have this, and it's because I guess council meetings. It seems to me that it's. I remember on my first term that it seems to me that it's all a kind of thing of continuous improvement, and I'm just wondering if the panel thinks it would be something that would be good for not for one particular council, but for the sector, for us all as colleagues, if you like, in the local government sector.
Thank you, Oliver. I think we've got the thrust of that.
Yes.
Now, did anyone wish to comment from our panel? It's a good idea.
It's a great idea. It's a great idea. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. The answer, yes. Yes. Like the referendum question. Yes. John's wanting to say, okay.